This time last year, my friend Emily had her first baby, and I remember really, really clearly when she was pregnant. Mostly I remember because she had to give up drinking, and this was really unfortunate. This was our favorite thing to do. We used to go to the pub every week and set the worlds to right, and now we couldn't do this anymore, which was really unfortunate. We had to come up with new activities, which was hard. But the other thing that I remember about her being pregnant was that everybody would always ask her the same question when they found out she was having a baby. And I'm sure all of you can guess what that question is, right? So the first question when you find out someone is pregnant is you want to know, are you having a girl or a boy? And Emily, she's English like me, so she's very polite, and she actually answered people properly, and she said that she was having a girl, and Scarlett was born last January. I like to think that if I was pregnant and somebody asked me if I was having a girl or a boy, that I would respond, probably, or that maybe if I was feeling extra cheeky, I might say, well, I don't know, I'm sure they'll let me know when they're old enough to figure it out for themselves. So even though I always have this reaction and get kind of annoyed by this question, I really understand where it comes from. The reason why people care about this question so much is that gender, whether we want it to be or not, is the backdrop against which we live our entire lives. So gender impacts what we wear, it impacts how we interact with people, it impacts the toys that we buy, it impacts who we sit with in the school lunchroom, and it even impacts where we can and can't go to the toilet, right? So it's really, really pervasive. So when I think about gender and how I became interested in it, sometimes I wonder if it's because when I was a little girl, I was a little gender ambiguous. My mum didn't know how to style hair, so she just cut it short. This is me with a mullet at age 7. It's slightly embarrassing. I can't believe I'm showing this to the world. But this is what I used to look like. And one of my earliest memories is going to the post office with my mum and with my brother, and this woman coming over and saying to my mum, oh, what beautiful twin boys you have. And I'm sure my brother doesn't remember this at all, but for me it was somewhat of a traumatic experience. This is actually why I always have long hair, because it really impacted me that much. And so I think sometimes maybe this is where my interest came from. I've always been interested in what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a boy, what gender is, what that means, what gender identity means. And so I've spent the last 15 years of my life, and it's crazy to think I've been doing this for that long, studying gender. So today what I'm going to tell you about is how psychology has been approaching gender historically, and how I think we need to be approaching it, not just in psychology, but as a society as we move forward. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit of some of the history of how psychologists have conceptualized gender. So one of the first gender models was Terman and Miles, and they came up with this bipolar model with masculinity on one end and femininity on the other. And so you could fall anywhere on the scale, regardless of your biological sex. And this was actually pretty revolutionary for its time. This came out in the 30s, 1936, they published a book on this. And I still hear to this day students and sometimes colleagues and friends referring to gender as something that happens along a continuum. So as I said, this was progressive, but there are some problems with this type of model. So with this model, you can be a little bit feminine, you could be a lot feminine, you can be a little bit masculine, you can be a lot masculine, but you can't be very feminine and very masculine at the same time. So in the 1970s, there were 2 feminist psychologists who were working independently. So Anne Constantinople was one of them, and Sandra Bem, some of you may have heard of her, was another one. And they both wrote separate papers talking about the idea that people could be feminine, they could be masculine, or they could be both feminine and masculine. And so Sandra Bem actually coined a term for this. You may have heard of it before, psychological androgyny. So I'm going to tell you a little bit now about my history with studying gender. So I did my PhD at West Virginia University, and when I got there, I knew that I wanted to study gender. That's actually why I picked WVU. There's a bunch of great gender researchers there. And so when you're a first-year graduate student, you spend a lot of time just wallowing in the literature. And so I was reading all of these things about gender and gender identity, and I found myself getting really confused and overwhelmed. I felt as though I just couldn't understand any of it. People were approaching it in so many different ways that I actually kind of gave up on studying gender identity, and I decided I was going to study gender and friendships, which I've really enjoyed and I really like. But recently, 2 years ago, I sat down to actually write a paper on gender identity. And so, again, I went back to the literature, and I typed gender identity into EBSCOhost, which is an academic database that indexes hundreds and thousands of academic articles, and I got back over 11,000 articles, all with this keyword gender identity. And so I thought, oh, let me just take a little sampling of these. I'll have a look and see how people are defining gender identity. And what I found was pretty crazy. There were lots of different definitions. So one of them was how you feel about your gender, femininity and masculinity, gendered behavior, gender contentment, bias toward gender groups, body gender identity, pressure to conform to gender roles, whether someone's butch or femme, and then even erotic roles. So all of these things came up as gender identity. So when I saw these, I actually felt comforted for a few minutes, because it's like, oh, it's not just me who finds this confusing, everyone's confused, we've all got different definitions. And then the more I looked at these, the more I realized, well, maybe this is what gender is. We're trying to narrow it down so much into one thing, and maybe it isn't really one thing. And so fortunately for me, I'm not the only person in psychology thinking this way. So a good friend of mine and colleague, Charlotte Tate, has written this wonderful paper where she describes the gender bundle. So I'm going to present that to you today. So you can imagine coming downstairs, the doorbell's rung, you open it up. Ooh, there's a big box of gender. Isn't this exciting? So we'll open it up. Out comes a whole bunch of gender for us to look at. And so now I'm going to go through each of these things and explain them to you a little bit. So the first one we've got here is your birth-assigned gender category. So this is the gender that is assigned to you at birth by some kind of cultural authority. So essentially, someone looks at your genitals and says you're a boy, you're a girl, or you're something else, maybe you're intersex. So the second one is your current gender identity, and this is your self-categorization. So how do you feel? What gender do you know yourself to be? And our gender identity profiles are calculated between both of these. So if your birth-assigned gender category matches with your current gender identity, we say that you're cisgender, and if it's different, we say that you're transgender. So now back to the rest of the gender bundle. So we've got gender roles. So this is how well you adhere to society's expectations for your gender. We've got gender social presentation. So this is how you look. Do you present as feminine? Do you present as masculine? Or do you play around with gender in the way that you dress and the way that you appear? And then the last one is gender evaluations. So how do you feel about your own gender group? And how do you feel about the other gender group? So looking at this bundle, I thought that it was great. I really liked it. But I felt that I wanted to add some more things to it. So in my own work, I've added gender salience. So this refers to how aware you are of your gender in any given moment. I've also added gender-type personality traits. So this refers to how feminine or masculine you are in terms of your stereotypical traits. So are you assertive? Are you nurturing? And then the last one that I added was gender reference group identity. So this is how similar and how psychologically connected you feel to your own gender. So hopefully you're looking at this bundle and this is kind of making sense to you and you're thinking, yes, yes, this is gender, it's all of these different things. And maybe you're even adding some of your own little boxes as you look at this, which I hope you are. But I'm going to complicate this just a little bit more. So I talked about Sandra Bem earlier. Sandra Bem came up with a measure. So in psychology, when we give people questionnaires, we call them measures. So she came up with a measure to assess people's femininity and masculinity, so their gender-type personality traits. And this is kind of what it looks like. These are some sample items from this measure. So this would be given to people, and they would look at it, and they would go through, and they would indicate on a scale of 0 to 7 how true these statements are for them. And so when they're doing this just at one point in time. So your femininity and masculinity is being measured at one point in time, and you're answering this in terms of how typical this trait is for you in general. So this assumes that these traits are stable and that they're consistent over time and over context. And I don't know about you, but when I think about my own life, this is definitely not true. So sometimes I'm really nurturing and loving and kind, and that's usually when I see a big fluffy dog, because like everyone else, I see a big fluffy dog and I just get down on the ground and start snuggling it. So this is what I do when I see a dog. So this is me being nurturing. But sometimes I can be assertive. So in my classes, I have a rule. I teach college. I have a rule that I do not accept late papers. And I actually, every time I talk about this, I get wound up about it because I get really annoyed. I do not take late papers. I think it's a good lesson for students to learn that you have to turn things in on time. And so if a student asks me, which inevitably every semester someone will come up to me and say, "Can I turn this in? It's late." And I say, "No, I told you at the beginning of the semester I don't take late papers." And so I'm always proud of myself for being really assertive about this. And then sometimes you get those students who just will not stop asking. And in those cases, I can even get aggressive. So these are examples of masculine traits, right? That depending on the context and who I'm interacting with, I'm going to be either more feminine, stereotypically or stereotypically masculine. And you don't have to just take my example. So President Obama, we can look at him. I know a lot of people are missing him right now. So he's a good example to use. So we've seen him exhibit good leadership skills. That's stereotypically masculine. People always talked about him playing basketball, so that's competitive, again, a masculine trait. And we've seen him be really assertive as well. But we also see him act kind and nurturing with his family. He was yielding when he let the kids get a dog. Remember that? Everyone was talking about them getting a dog at the White House. And we've even seen him be emotional after the Sandy Hook shooting. So again, you can see, it's not just me, probably for all of us, it depends on the context, who we're interacting with and what we're doing as to how feminine or how masculine we are. So back to the gender bundle. So I've just focused just now on one of these components. So I focused on gender-type personality traits. But when you look at this bundle, you can see that there are many components here that might vary across context. There are some that are going to stay the same. So our birth-assigned gender category, it doesn't really matter who we're interacting with or what we're doing. That's probably going to stay the same. But something like our gender evaluations is probably going to vary. So I might feel differently about my gender if I've just watched Hillary Clinton on TV versus watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which I will say is one of my dirty little secrets. I really like that show. And likewise, my evaluation of the other sex will probably vary depending on whether or not the guy I'm dating has recently made me some soup. So what I want you to take away from this is, first of all, that gender is multidimensional. We shouldn't be thinking about it as just being one thing anymore. And I also want us to be thinking about gender as being variable and context dependent. So in the beginning, I was talking about Scarlett. And what does this mean for the world that Scarlett, who just turned a year old a couple of weeks ago, what does this mean for the world she's growing up in? Well, it's going to be a little while until she's filling out her passport application and deciding what gender she's going to pick. But for now, I know that I've definitely seen her behave in feminine ways. She can be very emotional and very loving. And I've also seen her behave in masculine ways. She can be very assertive. She's 1 now. But I know that when I think about how she's going to cope in the future and how she's going to do, one thing that I do know is that she's pretty much prepared for anything that the context throws at her. Thank you.